The air in the Blackwood Ridge did not just feel cold, it felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp pine needles and an underlying decay that modern maps conveniently ignored. Nick Winchester adjusted the straps of his tactical pack, the nylon biting into his shoulders as he paused at the trailhead. Behind him, the rental SUV was already covered in a thin layer of morning dust, a frail metallic anchor to civilization they were about to leave behind. His friends, Marcus and Jesse, were still laughing, their voices entirely too loud for a forest that seemed to actively swallow sound. "Are you sure about this route, Nick?" Marcus asked, tossing a half-empty water bottle into his side pocket. The ranger at the station looked like he was about to give us a lecture on trespassing before you pulled out the state forestry permit. "The permit is valid, Marcus, and this is the only ridge that hasn't been logged to death," Nick replied, his voice calm though his eyes scanned the dense tree line. He wasn't entirely honest with them. He hadn't chosen Blackwood for the pristine scenery. He had chosen it because of the fragmented police reports, the strange disappearances, and the local lore of a creature that defied biological classification, the Dogman. As a seasoned tracker and outdoorsman, Nick didn't necessarily believe the internet forums, but he believed in anomalies, and something anomalous was happening in these woods. The first 3 miles were deceptive, offering the standard challenges of a steep, rocky incline. Jesse, a photographer whose stamina was sustained entirely by caffeine and stubbornness, stomped every few hundred yards to snap photos of the ancient twisted oak trees. "The light here is bizarre," Jesse muttered, adjusting the focus ring on his heavy DSLR camera. "It's barely noon, but the shadows are stretching like it's twilight. Look at how the canopy filters the sun." Nick looked, but he wasn't looking at the light. He was looking at the bark of a massive white pine 20 yards off the trail. 4 deep, parallel grooves were gouged into the wood, roughly 7 feet off the ground. The sap weeping from the wounds was fresh, sticky and amber, trapping insects that were still twitching. A bear would have left hair, a bear would have rubbed its back. These marks were clean, precise, and violently deep, cut by claws that acted more like chisels. "Keep moving, guys," Nick said quietly, stepping over a rotting log. "We want to reach the plateau before the temperature drops." By late afternoon, the atmosphere of Blackwood Ridge shifted from isolated to suffocating. The usual symphony of the wilderness, the chatter of blue jays, the rustle of chipmunks, the constant drone of cicadas, had vanished entirely. A profound, unnatural silence draped over the mountain, the kind of stillness that precedes a severe thunderstorm. Yet, the sky above remained a pale, cloudless gray. "Does anyone feel like the woods just went on mute?" Marcus asked, his previous bravado fading into a cautious whisper. He stopped, turning in a slow circle, his boots crunching loudly on the dry leaves. "Seriously, not even a breeze." "It's just the topography," Jesse said, though his voice lacked conviction as he lowered his camera. "We are in a natural bowl between 2 ridges. Sound doesn't travel well here." Nick didn't correct him, but his hand instinctively drifted down to the bear spray mounted on his hip, and his fingers brushed the cold steel of the hunting knife at his belt. He knew about the zone of silence, a phenomenon documented by countless hunters who had survived encounters with apex predators, specifically the bipedal canids of Native American lore. It wasn't a trick of geography, it was the forest holding its breath in the presence of a monster. Then came the first audio cue, a sound that made the hairs on Nick's arms stand perfectly rigid. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but a heavy, rhythmic thud, echoing from the ridge above them. It sounded like a massive weight being shifted from one limb to another, accompanied by the distinct, sickening snap of a thick oak branch. The sound was too heavy for a deer, too agile for a moose. What the hell was that? Marcus gasped, clutching his trekking poles like weapons. Probably a falling limb, Nick lied smoothly, his eyes locked on a dense thicket of mountain laurel 50 yards away. Through the tangled branches, for a fraction of a second, he saw it. A shape that didn't belong in nature. It was a massive pointed ear, coated in coarse, midnight black fur, twitching toward the sound of Marcus's voice. Above it, the silhouette of a shoulder humped upward, massive and muscular, shifting with a terrifying human-like fluid motion. The creature was standing on two legs, completely hidden by the foliage, watching them. "We are making camp here," Nick announced suddenly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The clearing ahead gives us visibility. Move now." Setting up the tents became a frantic race against the dying light. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, the shadows didn't just lengthen, they seemed to pour down the hillside like liquid ink. Nick insisted on gathering an excessive amount of firewood, building a perimeter of dry kindling around their small campsite. Marcus and Jesse worked in silence, the reality of their isolation finally sinking in. "Nick, look at this," Jesse called out from the edge of the clearing, his voice trembling slightly. He was pointing his flashlight at the mud near a small natural spring. Nick knelt beside him, the beam of his own light illuminating a track that made his stomach turn. It was a footprint, easily 14 inches long. The heel was narrow, like a canine's, but the instep was wide, ending in 4 distinct massive toe impressions with deep claw marks at the tips. What made Nick's blood run cold was the positioning. There was no sign of front paws. Whatever made this track had walked through the deep, sucking mud entirely upright, carrying an immense amount of weight. "Is that a wolf?" Jesse whispered, his camera clicking as he took a macro shot. "No wolf is this heavy, Jesse," Nick said, erasing the track with his boot to prevent panic. "Get back to the fire." Night fell over Blackwood Ridge with absolute authority. The campfire crackled, casting dancing orange shadows against the wall of trees that surrounded them like a wooden cage. Nobody slept. They sat on logs, staring into the flames, listening to the forest around them come alive with the sound of their stalkers. Around midnight, the harassment began in earnest. It started with the rocks, small pebbles at first, clattering through the branches and landing just outside the circle of firelight. Then, a large stone the size of a grapefruit crashed through the canopy and smashed into the dirt inches from Marcus's tent. "Hey, who's out there?" Marcus screamed into the darkness, his voice cracking with terror. "We have weapons. Leave us alone." The response was immediate, and it chilled Nick to the absolute bone. From 3 different directions around the camp, a sound rose into the night air. It was a deep, guttural huffing, like a massive pair of bellows forcing air through a throat lined with gravel. It was followed by a low, vibrating growl that was so deep Nick could feel it resonating in the fillings of his teeth and the bones of his chest. It wasn't one creature, they were surrounded by a pack. "Nick, what do we do?" Jesse whimpered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. Those aren't bears. Stay by the fire, Nick commanded, drawing his knife, his eyes darting across the darkness. They don't like the light, they're just testing us. As he spoke, a pair of eyes caught the firelight from 70 feet away, amber, glowing with a terrifying intelligent malice, positioned a full 8 feet above the ground. The game had begun. The embers of the campfire hissed as Nick threw another thick log of damp oak onto the flames, sending a violent shower of orange sparks spiraling up into the suffocating blackness. The amber eyes that had been staring from the brush blinked once, then melted backward into the shadows, but the heavy crunching sound of bipedal footsteps circling the perimeter did not stop. Marcus was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his tactical flashlight into the dirt, its beam cutting erratically across the trunks of the surrounding trees. "They're circling us, Nick. They're goddamn hunting us," Marcus whispered, his voice jagged with a raw terror that seemed to delight the things in the dark. "Pick up the light, Marcus, and keep your back to the fire," Nick commanded, his voice a sharp, steady contrast to his friend's spiraling panic. He held his long-bladed hunting knife tightly, his knuckles stark white against the black rubber grip, while his other hand gripped the heavy-duty bear spray canister. He knew the spray was a psychological comfort more than a true defense. If the legends were accurate, a 700-pound apex predator with the jaw pressure of a hyena wouldn't be stopped by mere pepper oil. Jesse sat entirely paralyzed, his expensive camera dangling uselessly from his neck, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared into the dark. Around 2 in the morning, the temperature plummeted drastically, turning their breath into thick plumes of silver vapor that caught the dying firelight. The rhythmic huffing sound from the eastern ridge grew louder, accompanied by a new, deeply unsettling noise, the sound of wood scraping against wood. Nick watched in disbelief as a young sapling, roughly 15 feet tall, was slowly and deliberately bent downward until its crest touched the forest floor, before being released with a violent thwack. It was a display of sheer, casual physical dominance, a message sent from the darkness. "We can break this forest, and we can break you." "They're trying to wear us down," Nick said, his eyes scanning the periphery, tracking the subtle shifts in the low-hanging branches. "They are pack hunters, but they aren't acting like wolves. Wolves attack when they have the numerical advantage, but these things are playing with us." He remembered reading accounts of the Land Between the Lakes encounters, where survivors claimed the creatures possessed a cruel, almost human-like intelligence. The psychological torment was part of the hunt. A sudden, high-pitched screech tore through the night from the western edge of the camp, causing Jesse to scream and dive flat onto the ground. It sounded like a woman's scream, but it mutated halfway through into a deep guttural roar that vibrated the very dirt beneath their boots. Instantly, a massive dark shape vaulted over the perimeter of dry kindling Nick had painstakingly built, landing with a heavy, double thud, just 10 feet from Marcus's tent. The firelight flickered wildly, illuminating the creature's lower torso, legs built like a grey wolf's but scaled up to massive proportions, covered in coarse, matted grey-black fur, ending in thick, humanoid ankles that defied the anatomy of any known quadruped. "Move!" Nick bellowed, lunging forward and discharging a massive cloud of orange bear spray directly toward the shape. The creature let out a wet, coughing sneeze and recoiled, the sheer speed of its retreat almost invisible to the human eye as it vanished back into the brush. The brief glimpse Nick caught of its upper body would haunt him forever. A chest broader than a professional weightlifter's, arms that ended in elongated hands with thick black talons, and a head that combined the worst features of a wolf and a primate. Its muzzle was shorter than a standard canine's, packed with an impossible density of jagged white teeth. "We can't stay here until morning," Jesse sobbed, clutching Nick's jacket as the orange mist of the pepper spray drifted back into their own faces, making their eyes sting and water. "They're going to come over the fire next time. Nick, they're going to kill us right here." Marcus was already grabbing his pack with erratic, uncoordinated movements, his mind completely broken by the proximity of the beast. "He's right. We run back to the SUV. We run right now." Marcus screamed, turning toward the main trail they had spent all afternoon climbing. "No, do not run," Nick shouted, grabbing Marcus by the collar of his jacket and throwing him back toward the heat of the fire. "If you run in the dark, you trigger their chase instinct, and they will catch you before you hit the tree line." Nick looked down at his compass, the needle spinning erratically as if caught in a localized magnetic anomaly, another detail from the old reports that he had dismissed as fiction but was now witnessing firsthand. "The main trail is compromised. They want us to go back that way because they've likely blocked it or have the rest of the pack waiting." As if confirming his theory, a series of heavy thuds echoed from the path behind them, followed by the sound of a massive boulder rolling down the incline and crashing into a ravine. The creatures were actively manipulating their environment, herding them like livestock. Nick's mind raced, his tactical training kicking in through the fog of adrenaline. To the north lay the old abandoned limestone quarry, a place the locals warned was unstable and dangerous, but it was bordered by sheer rock face. If they could reach the quarry, they could eliminate the threat of being surrounded from behind. "We move north toward the quarry," Nick ordered, his voice leaving no room for panic or debate. "Pack only what you can carry in your hands. Leave the tents, leave the heavy gear." He grabbed Jesse's arm, forcing the photographer to look him in the eyes. "Jesse, keep your camera flash ready. If they get close, I want you to strobe them with everything that battery has." Jesse nodded dumbly, his knuckles white around the camera grip. They moved out of the protective circle of the fire in a tight wedge formation, Nick leading with his knife and flashlight, Marcus in the center, and Jesse covering their rear. The moment their feet left the clearing, the forest seemed to close in around them like a living fist. The darkness was absolute, the canopy above blocking out whatever faint starlight the night offered. Behind them, they could hear the distinct sound of the creatures destroying their abandoned camp, the tearing of nylon tents, the snapping of aluminum poles, and the sickening crunching sound that sounded like metal being chewed. A massive branch fell from the canopy directly in front of Nick, missing his head by mere inches. He looked up just in time to see a massive shadow, easily 9 feet tall, leaping from the branches of an old oak to a neighboring pine with impossible agility. The Dogman wasn't just a ground predator, it was perfectly comfortable in the trees, stalking them from a vertical plane they couldn't effectively defend against. "Faster," Nick urged, his boots slipping on the slick moss as the incline began to tilt downward into the rocky gorge that led to the quarry. The harassment escalated from psychological to physical as they descended deeper into the ravine. Coarse, heavy claws raked against the trunks, of trees beside them as they passed, leaving fresh, pale gashes in the wood that stood out like scars in the flashlight beams. A low, continuous vibration filled the air, a sound so deep it felt less like an audible noise and more like a physical pressure building inside their eardrums. It was infrasound, the same low-frequency growl used by tigers to paralyze their prey with fear. Marcus stumbled his foot catching on an exposed root, and he tumbled down a short embankment, his flashlight flying from his hand and shattering against a rock. "Nick, my leg!" he cried out in the darkness. Instantly, the bushes above Marcus exploded with movement, and the massive canine head lunged from the leaves, its amber eyes burning with a terrifying, demonic hunger. The jaws snapped shut inches from Marcus's face, the sound like two heavy planks of wood being slammed together with immense force. Before the slavering jaws could snap a second time, Nick lunged down the embankment, his body colliding heavily with the creature's dense, muscular shoulder. It felt like hitting a wall of solid stone wrapped in coarse burlap. But the unexpected impact was enough to throw the monster's aim off. "Jesse, the Flash, now!" Nick roared, scrambling backwards through the dirt as the beast whirled its massive upper torso around to face him. A blinding, high-powered strobe light shattered the pitch-black darkness as Jesse frantically mashed the shutter button, the intense white light illuminating the nightmare in horrific, stop-motion fragments. The creature was massive, its chest covered in thick scars, its pointed ears pinned flat against a skull that was terrifyingly wide. The brilliant light worked. The Dogman let out a high-pitched, painful whine, covering its face with an elongated clawed forearm as it reeled backward into the thick brush. "Get up, Marcus, move," Nick yelled, hauling his bruised friend to his feet by his backpack straps, while Jesse continued to back away, keeping his camera raised like a shield. Marcus groaned, limping heavily as he favored his left ankle, but the pure adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him moving forward. They scrambled through the final thicket of briars, bursting out of the suffocating forest and onto the white, gravel-strewn floor of the abandoned limestone quarry. The quarry was a stark, desolate landscape, a massive crater carved into the side of the mountain by machines that had long since rusted away. Sheer vertical limestone cliffs rose over 80 feet into the night air on three sides, providing the exact tactical barrier Nick had been looking for. However, as his flashlight beam swept across the open floor, he realized they were entirely exposed. There was no cover, just piles of crushed gravel, rusted iron cables, and a few decaying wooden shacks that looked ready to collapse. Behind them, the tree line they had just escaped began to shake violently as the rest of the pack arrived at the perimeter. "They're not coming out into the open yet," Jesse whispered, his breathing shallow and rapid as he checked the battery indicator on his flash unit. "Why aren't they attacking? There's no fire to stop them now." Nick swept his light along the edge of the woods, catching the distinct reflection of at least 4 pairs of glowing amber eyes staring back at them from different heights. "Because they know we're cornered," Nick said grimly, wiping a mixture of sweat and rain from his forehead. "They are savoring it. They want us to realize there is nowhere left to run." Keeping their eyes fixed on the tree line, the trio backed toward the largest of the decaying wooden structures, an old foreman's office built against the base of the highest cliff wall. The wooden planks were rotten, the windows long since shattered, but it offered a roof and a single narrow doorway they could easily defend. As they slipped inside, the smell of old oil, wet rust, and mouse droppings greeted them, a metallic sanctuary that felt entirely temporary. Marcus collapsed onto a broken bench, cradling his swollen ankle, his face completely pale in the dim light. "We are dead here, Nick," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of hope as he stared at the floor. "We have a knife, a camera, and an empty can of bear spray. When those things decide to come across the gravel, we can't stop them." Nick didn't answer right away. Instead, he began searching the dark corners of the shack with his flashlight, kicking over rusted tin cans and old wooden crates. He knew that giving up meant death, and his survival instinct refused to let him accept that conclusion. "Shut up, Marcus, and look for anything we can use. Tools, chemicals, anything left behind by the workers." Outside, the harassment took on a terrifying new form: communication. From the eastern side of the quarry, a long, mournful howl tore into the night, but it didn't sound like a typical wolf. It started low and guttural, vibrating through the limestone walls, before rising into a discordant, multi-toned shriek that sounded almost mechanical. An instant later, an answering call echoed from the western ridge, closer this time, followed by a series of sharp, rhythmic barks that sounded like a military squad organizing an assault. The pack was coordinating their positions, sealing off the entrance to the quarry entirely. Jesse, who was looking out the broken window frame, gasped and pulled his head back inside. "Nick, they're moving into the open. They're walking on two legs, just strolling across the gravel like people." Nick hurried to the window, his eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight that illuminated the quarry floor. Three massive silhouettes were moving deliberately across an open expanse, their long, powerful arms swinging slightly at their sides. They moved with a terrifying grace, their bipedal gait smooth and unbroken by the uneven terrain, proving without a doubt that these were not animals driven by simple instinct, but something far more malevolent. "I found something," Jesse shouted suddenly from the back of the shack, his flashlight illuminating a heavy iron trapdoor set into the concrete floor. Nick ran over, helping Jesse clear away a pile of rotting canvas tarps that covered the heavy metal ring. Together, straining until their muscles screamed, they pulled the rusty hatch open, revealing a steep concrete stairwell that descended into a pitch-black subterranean chamber. A blast of icy, stagnant air pushed up from the darkness, carrying a sharp, distinct smell of sulfur and chemical powder. "It's an old explosives locker," Nick realized, his heart hammering against his ribs as he shone his light down the stairs. This is where they kept the blasting caps and dynamite for the quarry operations. He scrambled down the steps, his boots kicking up decades of thick dust, with Jesse and Marcus following closely behind, shutting the heavy iron door above them and sliding the rusted locking bolt into place, just as a heavy impact shook the shack above. The monsters had reached the building. The basement was small, reinforced with thick concrete pillars that held up the ceiling, but what caught Nick's attention was a heavy steel cage in the corner. Inside the cage, resting on a wooden pallet, were several wooden crates marked with stenciled letters: "Danger, high explosives." Nick's hope flared, but it was quickly extinguished when he pried open the closest lid. The dynamite inside had degraded over 40 years, sweating out nitroglycerin until the sticks were weeping, unstable, and incredibly dangerous to touch. One wrong move, would blow the entire ridge apart. However, next to the dynamite crates sat something else, a metal cabinet containing several industrial canisters of calcium carbide used for old miners' slumps, and several jars of ancient white phosphorus powder used for old signaling flares. Nick's eyes widened as his knowledge of chemistry clicked into place. He knew exactly what these chemicals could do when combined properly. Above them, the iron trapdoor began to groan and buckle as a massive weight slammed against it repeatedly, the screech of bending metal echoing through the concrete chamber. The heavy iron trapdoor groaned again, a violent clang echoing through the concrete bunker as the metal warped downward under the immense crushing force. "Jesse, hold your flashlight right here and don't let it shake," Nick ordered, his fingers working with frantic, precise speed as he hauled 2 canisters of calcium carbide and a glass jar of white phosphorus onto an old wooden workbench. He knew that white phosphorus was pyrophoric, meaning it would ignite spontaneously in the air once exposed, and when combined with the highly flammable acetylene gas produced by wetting calcium carbide, it would create an unstable, blinding chemical firestorm. With his hunting knife, he repeatedly punctured the metal caps of the carbide canister, then grabbed a half-empty canteen of water from Marcus's pack, pouring it directly into the vents. Instantly, a violent hissing chemical reaction began, a sharp, garlic-like odor of acetylene gas filling the tight bunker. "Marcus, take these glass jars of phosphorus and wrap them in your spare flannel shirt," Nick hissed, his eyes locked on the ceiling as a massive black-clawed hand punched completely through the buckled iron door above them. The talons raked against the concrete edges, accompanied by a hideous, eager screech that sounded like metal grinding against glass. "We only get one shot at this. When that door gives way, we throw the phosphorus jars into the gas cloud and run like hell up the stairs." The rusted locking bolt sheared off completely, and the iron trapdoor was ripped off its hinges, thrown back into the wooden shack above with a deafening crash. The opening was immediately filled by a massive slavering shape, the alpha of the pack, a towering beast with fur the color of dried blood, its amber eyes glowing with an intelligent demonic malice. It dropped into the bunker with a heavy floor-shaking thud, its lips curled back to reveal 3-inch fangs, dripping with thick, ropey saliva. It let out a deafening roar that shattered the glass lens of Jesse's flashlight, plunging the room into a terrifying twilight zone, lit only by the faint chemical glow of the bubbling canisters. "Now, throw them!" Nick yelled, hurling a punctured carbide canister directly at the monster's chest, while Marcus desperately smashed the phosphorus jars against the concrete floor, right at the creature's feet. The moment the ancient white phosphorus powder made contact with the oxygen in the room, it ignited into an instantaneous brilliant flash of white, hot fire, reaching temperatures of over 2000 degrees. The dense cloud of acetylene gas caught the flame, exploding into a localized roaring fireball that engulfed the front half of the bunker. The Dogman let out an agonizing high-pitched scream, a sound of pure animal torment as the chemical fire clung to its thick fur, blinding it instantly and filling the air with the stench of burning hair and scorched flesh. "Go, go, go!" Nick screamed, grabbing the back of Jesse's jacket and shoving him toward the concrete stairs, while Marcus, completely ignoring the pain in his sprained ankle, scrambled up the steps on his hands and knees. They burst out of the subterranean hatch and back into the foreman's office, the building already filling with thick, white chemical smoke that poured up from the basement. Outside in the quarry, the remaining 3 members of the pack were retreating in absolute terror, their primitive brains utterly shattered by the sight of their alpha being consumed by an artificial, blinding sun. The creatures, usually the undisputed masters of the dark, scrambled frantically back toward the tree line on all fours, their bipedal arrogance completely broken by the terrifying display of human ingenuity. "Don't stop! The dynamite is going to catch," Nick roared, looking back to see the orange glow of the fire intensifying beneath the floorboards, threatening to detonate the weeping sticks of nitroglycerin left in the cage below. They sprinted out of the wooden shack and across the wide gravel floor of the quarry, their boots kicking up clouds of grey dust as they raced toward the narrow access road that led down the mountain. Behind them, a sharp, concussive boom shook the entire ridge, a shockwave of compressed air, throwing all 3 men flat onto the gravel as the foreman's office vanished in a spectacular eruption of wood splinters, limestone debris, and orange flame. The blast echoed through the canyon like a continuous roll of thunder, triggering a minor rock slide that sealed the bunker entrance under tons of solid stone. Gasping for air, Nick was the first to stand, his face covered in soot and his jacket torn to shreds, but his eyes were sharp as he looked back at the smoking ruins. The fire from the explosion was spreading slowly to the nearest trees, creating a bright protective barrier of flame between them and the deeper forest. "Marcus, Jesse, get up," Nick said, his voice raspy from the smoke but entirely steady as he helped his shivering friends to their feet. "The pack won't come near this fire, and the blast will have alerted the forest rangers. We walk down the access road right now." 2 hours later, as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the eastern sky, the 3 men finally reached the paved highway at the base of Blackwood Ridge. Their rental SUV sat untouched under the morning mist, a boring, beautiful piece of normal reality that felt a million miles away from the nightmare they had just survived. As Jesse unlocked the doors with trembling fingers, Nick paused one last time, looking back up at the smoking, scattered silhouette of the mountain. From the distant, unburned ridge, a single, frustrated howl echoed through the morning air, a promise that the things in the dark were still there. But Nick Winchester had faced the pack, used the earth to fight back, and come out on top.